Kia ora. Welcome to CARE's COVID-19 lecture series. I am delighted that we are able to host this series for you and bring with us a number of scholars, community organizers, activists, and policymakers who will share with you their experiences working through and within the context of COVID-19, and particularly engaging with some of the issues that are vital to the work that we do at CARE. Issues of community democracy, community voice, structural inequalities, and the ways in which COVID-19 offers us a window into imagining transformative openings for organizing our societies, for organizing economics and politics, and certainly for organizing healthcare. I'll be opening the series for you, and today's lecture will focus on one key concept that forms the primary theoretical basis of the culture-centered approach, or the CCA, as I will refer to it throughout the lecture, and that is the concept of communicative equality. Now, you will see this concept be grappled with in a variety of contexts by various activists, community organizers, as well as by academics, really engaging with that question of how do we build spaces where there are democratic opportunities for voices, and especially for the voices of the margins, in articulating a response, in developing the ways in which broader infrastructures can address COVID-19, as well as in addressing issues of work, issues of income, issues of food security, issues of housing, that are all intertwined with the kinds of challenges that are brought to surface with COVID-19. So in my lecture on communicative equality today, what I will do is I will begin by defining the concept of communicative equality for you, and I will situate it within the context of the CCA. So we will look at the ways in which the concept enables us to engage methodologically with the broader question of community democracy and how that connects to COVID-19, and also in terms of developing a practical politics of social change. In that sense, then, how do we rapidly develop policies that are responsive to the vast inequalities that are laid bare by COVID-19? We will specifically look at this question of communicative equality within the context of COVID-19, and then wrap up with the question of what we can do as academics, as community organizers, as activists, as citizens and advocates, in terms of challenging and starting to question some of the fundamental logics that naturalize inequalities. If there is one thing that is clear with this pandemic, it is that globally we are in the midst of large-scale inequalities, and these inequalities fundamentally impact the ways in which pandemics affect the broader population. Inequalities in that sense become more visible or more pronounced with the spread of the virus, both in terms of the trajectories of the virus, as well as the effects that are produced because of several policies that are put into place to deal with the virus, bring to surface the massive inequalities that have become normalized in societies across the globe today. Large-scale neoliberal reforms that have pushed the free market as the solution to human health and well-being, based on the ideology that the market will solve it all, have created unsustainable infrastructures across the globe, where the necessities of those at the margins, where the rights of those at the margins, and the everyday context of well-being for those at the margins have systematically been ignored or erased. Now, what we see with COVID-19 then is that these very sites where there have been weak infrastructures or literally absent infrastructures are the sites where COVID-19 actually plays out, actually expresses itself in terms of its effects. So first, let's look at the question of the trajectories of infections. COVID-19 travels, yeah? It travels across the routes of globalization and global movement of labor and human bodies. Uh, but it also travels unequally, such that it leaves its mark on those sites and spaces that are left most vulnerable because of policies of globalization that have actually attacked the capacities of organizations and workers to unionize and collectivize, to have a voice through collectives. It expresses itself in those spaces where public welfare and social welfare have been severely depleted. It expresses itself in those places where we see large numbers of people that have been expelled out or that have been displaced because of the massive effects of globalization and its accelerated forms of resource extraction and wealth accumulation. So particularly in terms of the pathways of movement of the virus, we see that it spreads in spaces where you don't have adequate and decent housing, in spaces where you are unable to practice the basic norms of physical distancing. It spreads in spaces where you do not have decent and adequate sanitation facilities, where you do not have access to clean water, both clean drinking water as well as water to wash your hands and follow the preventive behaviors that are recommended. It's spread in spaces where you don't have access to the basic infrastructures of food, so where there is food insecurity. So within these contexts, then, let's think about the ways in which these large-scale inequalities and particularly the absence of resources contribute to the structural conditions that enable the spread of the virus. I have here an image of Singapore, and for those of you that have been following the Singapore story, particularly with the latest round of COVID-19 outbreaks in migrant worker dormitories, you know that the context within which the virus has spread within these dormitories is a structural context where you have between 12 and 20 workers often staying within one room in a dormitory, and where therefore they are unable to practice physical distancing measures. Similarly, for instance, you see in the infrastructures of urban poverty in Mumbai, in India, for instance, where you have the spread of COVID-19, people do not have an opportunity to practice physical distancing. So this really brings to bear the question of what is decent housing and how do we address these infrastructures of housing within the backdrop of the spread of a virus. And within the context of a pandemic then, or any future pandemic, a salient question for us is, what are the conditions of decent housing? What are the conditions of decent access to sanitation and water? What are the conditions of access to food that are integral to ensuring that we have systems that can respond well to the crisis? In addition to sort of the effects of the trajectory of the virus, we also have effects of the interventions. So these interventions have been created in order to stop the spread of COVID-19. So one of these interventions, for instance, is the lockdown. What we witnessed in India with regard to the lockdown is that when the lockdown was initially implemented, you witnessed large numbers of migrant workers that had migrated from rural and suburban areas of India into the big cities. These are your digital infrastructures, the smart cities, the IT cities of India. Those workers were expelled onto the open spaces, onto the roads, traveling for miles in order to get home without access to water, without access to food, and without access to transportation. So this kind of inhuman condition is produced by a politics of inequality that has been naturalized in our system, such that without access to opportunities for organizing, without access to minimum wage, without access to policies that protect them, precarious workers literally were thrown out when the lockdown went into place. And this really raises the question of how do we deal with issues of access to a basic wage or an income? So the question of universal basic income is really salient here. Questions of access to basic food. Now, in many parts of the globe, among the global margins, you're witnessing with the lockdown tremendous food insecurity, the challenges with accessing food, with food that is of decent quality, barriers to accessing testing. There are inequalities in terms of access to healthcare that become more pronounced within the context of COVID-19. Who does or does not have access to testing? Who is or is not able to afford access to testing? Barriers to accessing healthcare. So once again, we see that with the dramatic attack on public health that has been launched by neoliberal policies, and particularly by the ideology of public-private partnerships, global foundations that have been driving privatization of health systems, that our healthcare systems have weakened in terms of their ability to respond to the crisis, and particularly in terms of the ability to deliver care. We also see COVID-19 actually, and particularly the lockdown within that context, and actually throwing low income or middle income households into cycles of poverty because of job loss, because of access to forms of because of lack of access to forms of paid leave, and because of protections at the workplace. So within this broader picture, when we think about both the trajectories of COVID-19 as well as the effects of the interventions that have been created in order to address COVID-19, inequalities become salient. So when we address COVID-19, we have to fundamentally ask, how do we address the inequalities that create the base on which COVID-19 flourishes? Within this question, then, the culture-centered approach comes up with the argument that to address these large-scale structural issues, we need to build infrastructures of communicative equality. I will first begin by defining communicative equality for you and going through its key tenets, and then connecting it to the question of structures and structural equality, and then finally weaving it into COVID-19. So what is communicative equality? Communicative equality is equality in the distribution of information resources. You can think of information resources as information about particular content. So it could be information about appropriate preventive behaviors, for instance. It could be information about how to practice a preventive behavior, such as how to practice hand washing and how to implement hand washing. What is the effective way to wash your hands that would protect you? So these kinds of information resources are often content-specific information resources that offer guidance on prevention, that offer guidance on what potentially you could be doing if you have been infected, in terms of following precautionary measures to stop the spread any further. It could also be information about the latest research related to COVID-19, the science as we know it, as it is changing and as it is dynamic. There are also resources in terms of resources of representation, where we think of platforms and spaces where communities, where particular groups or particular segments of the population are represented. So how are resources distributed in terms of who gets represented, who is doing the work of representing, and who is producing the kinds of images that represent particular groups within the context of COVID-19. Then we have equality in the distribution of resources for decision making. These are vital within the context of pandemic. As we have witnessed globally, there are major decisions, fairly impactful decisions, all the way from what is a lockdown, when is a lockdown going to be implemented, for how long, what kinds of physical distancing measures are going to be implemented, what kinds of support are going to be available for people in the midst of the lockdown, what kinds of support are going to be available for those at the very margins of our societies during the lockdown. These kinds of decisions are being made on an everyday basis at a fairly rapid pace. So the question then becomes one of asking, who is able to make these decisions, who sits in these decision-making spaces, and how are these resources for decision-making distributed in our societies, which then connects with the question of resources for voice. So whose voices are we hearing within the context of COVID-19? Whose voices are we not hearing, especially as it connects to the deep inequalities then? Communication equality ties in with the idea, how are these spaces for voices distributed across society? So where are these resources for voices concentrated, and where they have been depleted or erased? A lot of this really builds on my early work on the culture-centered approach that argued that the massive communicative inequalities in the societies in which we live today are intrinsically tied to the kinds of inequalities in health outcomes that we witness across the globe. Tied to the notion of distribution of resources then is the question of ownership of communicative resources. So we should really be asking, who owns these communicative resources, and to what agendas are these resources then being deployed? Now, the ownership of communicative resources is a critical question in the context of COVID-19, because it shapes the ways in which particular narratives are constructed and circulated, while at the same time strategically working to erase other narratives. So we can ask again, who owns information resources? So in terms of preventive information, for instance, where are these pieces of information being created, and where are they being circulated? And who owns those platforms where these pieces of information are being circulated? Similarly, we should ask questions about the ownership of resources for representation. So who is doing the work of representing and owning the infrastructures where the representing is actually taking place? So when you consider, for instance, the margins of the globe, so the challenges that precarious migrant workers are experiencing today, you should be asking, what communicative infrastructures do precarious migrant workers own, where they could articulate and circulate their voices? Similarly, we should ask questions about ownership of resources for decision making. Of course, in democracies, we argue that these resources for decision making are owned by the people, but the increasing consolidation of power globally and the co-optation of democratic processes within private logics has meant that the spaces of decision making are narrowly constrained in the hands of the global power elite. They are narrowly constrained in the hands of transnational corporations, transnational foundations, and state elites that often are more committed to serving the interests of transnational capital through the state market nexus than to serving the needs of those at the margins of our societies. And finally, we should ask a question about equality in terms of the ownership of resources for voice. So who owns the voice infrastructures in society? How are these voice infrastructures distributed in our societies? And what are the kinds of patterns of inequality we see in terms of the distribution of these voice infrastructures? So then communicative equality actually works toward or seeks to build spaces for ownership of information infrastructures where you can make knowledge claims, but where you can also have access to knowledge claims. So how do we create infrastructures where communities at the very margins have access to the latest science? How do we open up the processes of scientific discovery and the claims that emerge through science, especially within the context of a pandemic where the scientific process itself is rapidly evolving and emerging? So how do we create these open spaces where access to science is equal and where communities at the margins of our societies actually own these spaces of information infrastructures? How do we create ownership of information infrastructures at the margins of societies, especially in terms of those pieces of information that point to structural resources? So one of the things that we see often within the context of health crises or health threats is that although there is preponderance of targeted information, often targeting the very marginalized communities, which in this sort of language is defined as hard to reach communities, with sort of the preventive behaviors. So you need to maintain 1 meter distance, and we will see a bunch of messaging that talks about culturally contextualizing these messages so that you can have those messages in the languages of those at the margins, while really doing very little in terms of giving information about how to secure access to structural resources. So if I, for instance, need to practice hand washing, where would I go to get soap? How would I get access to water if I'm in a community that has limited access to water? These are the kinds of questions that are structural. And we need to think about how do we build information resources and the ownership of information resources, particularly within the context of resources that point to how to use these structures and how to navigate them. Then we can also consider information infrastructures in terms of decision-making processes. So if I am a low-wage migrant worker in Singapore, or if I am a migrant worker in Noida, in India, how am I going to access decision-making structures and decision-making processes so that I can actually bring my lived experiences to bear on the ways in which policies are being implemented, and also the ways in which policies are being created now, as well as for the future. We can also consider ownership of resources or voice in terms of voice within decision-making processes. So how do we build these decision-making processes in ways that actually create opportunities for ownership of voice infrastructures by those at the margins? How do we create resources for voice in terms of voicing in those spaces that are making decisions about structural resources? So how can voice emerge in meaningful ways that can point to the structural constraints and the structural forces that shape behavior, such as advocating for access to water, or advocating for access to housing, or advocating for access to sanitation. And then how do we create resources for voice to knowledge claims, such that the very knowledge claims that are being made within the context of COVID-19 not only are anchored in science and the latest scientific discoveries, but they are also anchored in the lived experiences, voices, and cultural resources that communities at the margins bring to bear. So the question of communicative equality, therefore, turns to the broader question of how do we build spaces for ownership. Here in this image, you have an image from field work in India, where CARE works with the civil society organization as well as the farmer-led cooperative called Deccan Development Society. In Deccan Development Society, or DDS, Dalit women farmers, who often are sort of at the caste class margins of Indian society, have organized over the last 3 decades at taking back the infrastructures of decision making related to agriculture. And in order to take back these infrastructures of decision making related to agriculture, particularly drawing on contextually embedded indigenous ways of practicing agriculture, the women organized in the Sangham have felt that they need to own the communicative infrastructures. So here you see them actually recording their voices, and this is one way in which they generate knowledge. And these recordings of voices actually go into the community radio that is owned and run by DDS. So the community radio becomes a space for articulating communicative equality through ownership of resources for voice. And this is what in our work, Jagadish Thakur and I call communicative sovereignty, the space where communities at the margins can create infrastructures where they can voice their own imaginaries, their own knowledge, of course, in empirically anchored ways that are embedded in their lived experiences, but that are also avenues for then challenging the existing forms of organizing in politics and economics. So to think about the question of communication equality, then, we need to carefully attend to the ways in which voice and communication are tied to power. The reason we have deep inequalities, communicative inequalities in the societies in which we live is because of entrenched decision making by state, private corporations, as well as civil society organizations that often co-opt these spaces of decision making, that often in the process of co-opting these spaces erase the margins. So the work of erasure of the margins is an active work of also producing specific forms of knowledge that serve the interests of global transnational capital. So power, particularly in terms of the ability to control what is being said, how it is being said, and to what agendas are our knowledge claims being used, shapes the distribution of communicative resources in our society. So this work of disenfranchisement, or continually cultivating communicative inequality, is tied to the consolidation of power in the hands of the global neoliberal elite, to push the privatization of spaces. It is salient that the elite push a technocratic form of expert-driven decision-making, where elites can make the key decisions and then pass them on top down, while simultaneously delegitimizing, discounting, and erasing the lived experiences of those at the margins. So the active work of erasure is integral to the upholding of the neoliberal ideology. The logic of neoliberalism that actually has produced deep inequalities across the globe survives on the erasure of communicative spaces at the margins and on the cultivation of deep communicative inequalities, such that the greater the number of communicative platforms that are owned by those at sites of power, the greater the ability to formulate and implement policies that enable the disenfranchisement of large sectors of the globe. So in this sense, then, the culture-centered approach argues communicative inequalities and structural inequalities are intertwined, meaning that the inequalities in the distribution of resources of representation and recognition are deeply intertwined with the inequalities in material access to resources, the distribution of these resources, as well as access to policies and programs. And of course, that then relates to access to the sites where resources are actually distributed in societies. So when I say that communicative inequality mirrors and reflects structural inequality, I'm also arguing that on one hand, communicative inequality is produced by material inequality. The fact that those with access to wealth, those with control over economic systems are also the ones that make decisions about how wealth will be distributed and what kinds of economic policies will be pursued. At the same time, this kind of communicative inequality then sustains and reproduces structural inequality and inequality in the distribution of material resources. So because the voices of the margins, voices of those in poverty, voices of migrant workers, voices of precarious workers are often missing from dominant discursive spaces, the kinds of policies then that are created are the ones that serve the interests of the status quo, the interests of private corporations, the interests of transnational corporations, as well as the interests of state actors that are deeply aligned with private interests. So within the context of COVID-19, then one could argue that the inequalities that we are seeing being manifest with COVID-19, as well as the highly unequal effects that are being produced by COVID-19 related interventions that are being crafted by states, are deeply intertwined with the communicative inequalities in spaces and at sites within nations and across nations, particularly in terms of who is participating in decision-making processes, who is having a voice, what narratives are being foregrounded, and what narratives are being erased. This recognition that communicative inequalities and structural inequalities are intertwined is then also the basis for creative imaginaries for how can we disrupt these inequalities? How can we create spaces for responding to COVID-19 in ways that are just, that are grounded in meeting the needs of those at the margins? And in order to do so, the answer from this framework really is, well, these communicative infrastructures and their ownership patterns need to be changed fundamentally. We need to agitate toward transforming our everyday policy structures and decision-making structures and media structures and other spaces for voices, so that those at the margins of our societies can own these spaces, can have a say in these spaces, and can inform the kinds of policies that are and interventions that are being created. More than inform, though, can actually hold policymakers and decision makers to account based on their participation in democratic processes. So communication in the hegemonic sense of neoliberal ideology works as a site of erasure, where the voices of the subaltern and the body of the subaltern are incorporated through technocratic mediatized solutions to serve the interests of state, civil society, and market within a narrow configuration of democracy that is constituted within the logics of capital in fundamentally undemocratic ways, which is to suggest that even as spaces have disappeared for those at the margins and for subaltern communities to participate in, the subaltern body emerges as a site for interventions. So you see across the globe interventions, particularly what I term in my work as culturally sensitive interventions. These interventions are framed as if they are responding to a culture of a particular marginalized community. And these are being created in order to very much sustain the neoliberal status quo, so that you can use the same messages about hand washing and physical distancing, recommend individual behaviors in culturalist language while you're leaving the structures intact and not really addressing the questions of the structures. Technology, of course, also is incorporated into these processes, such as you see the proliferation of techno-deterministic solutions, all the way from message tailoring through technologies or messaging through digital media, often addressed as messaging directed at fighting disinformation, to technologies for contact tracing that again foreground the technology while simultaneously erasing the capacities of communities at the margins to have a voice, to participate fundamentally in decision making, and to transform the scope of decision making in response to COVID-19. In this picture, you see I have academe in one corner, because academe is instrumental in the production of the neoliberal order. So if we look at the kinds of ideologies we are reproducing within academia in responding to COVID-19 as a crisis, most of our responses are configured within this broader framework of communication as erasure, upholding the logics of the market while leaving intact the deep structural inequalities that have been created, that have been reproduced in accelerated patterns by neoliberal reforms across the globe. So as a paradox, for instance, you have Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation talking about the ways in which we can create global pandemic responses, while simultaneously completely forgiving and forgetting the fundamental role of the Gates Foundation in producing the knowledge systems that uphold these deep structural inequalities, as well as that uphold the attack on public health systems across the globe. So the CCA in this backdrop argues that in order to address these deep structural inequalities, the inequalities that we are witnessing today, we have to learn from below. This draws from the work of Gayatri Spivak to argue that it's vital to cultivate sensibilities of pedagogy that learn from the margins. And in this way, both dismantle dominant structures where the forms of decision making are embedded in consolidation of power, but also democratize spaces by pushing for democracy and by pushing for voice, the sorts of democracy that are sort of the sites where the voices of the margins can participate and own infrastructures of communication. It's an invitation to cultivate an ethic of patient listening to the other, particularly in the midst of the narratives of individual responsibility, the stigmatizing narratives that are often circulated by hegemonic structures. An ethic of listening to the other cultivates an openness within our communicative spaces that is fundamentally directed at challenging the communicative inequalities. So when you're looking at a media report, for instance, on migrant worker infections in dormitories in Singapore, with the migrant worker behaviors, referring to migrant worker behaviors, you should question the narrative, particularly in terms of who is owning this space, who is crafting this narrative, with what purposes, and then be asking, where are the voices of the migrant workers? And cultivating these spaces for communicative equality, which we can all do in our everyday interactions, are then the basis for building spaces where we can work toward other imaginations that invert the dominant structures of meaning making and instead populate these structures with meanings from the margins. So I want to here give you an example from the work of DDS that I referred to earlier in terms of what do I mean by voice infrastructures as material interventions. So in their work, the women farmers organized in Sanghams in the DDS were particularly or are particularly invested in challenging the form of neoliberal agriculture that is being pushed all across India, that is driven by logics of growth, privatization, and pursuit of profit through a cash-based economy. And the women argue in their work that there are other forms of agriculture that are sustainable, that exist within the spaces of community life and that draw on indigenous knowledge traditions. So they go back to the question of what do we know from our parents and our grandparents about growing seeds, about community or collective relationship with farming and the environment. And through this process, then, they develop a form of indigenous agriculture that is based on the logic of passing seeds in communities rather than having to buy seeds in the markets, growing food crops, growing a diverse array of food crops that reflect the biological diversity of these spaces in South India. But in order to build these material infrastructures in terms of materially intervening into agriculture in a context where farmers are inundated with advertising and with messages of biotechnology-driven profit-oriented agriculture, the women figured out that they need to actually create communicative spaces. And these communicative spaces they felt could be imagined in ways that are built into the rhythm of community life. So one such example here is the bullock cart. On the bullock cart here during this Bija Yatra, or what is a seed procession, the women have placed their seed banks, and they travel with these seed banks singing songs of the seed. But these songs of the seed are also ways of imparting and cultivating forms of knowledge about what agriculture could be. So these are ways of imagining agriculture as well as materially intervening. What's really powerful in this example is sort of the challenge that it offers to our concept of what constitutes communication infrastructure. So in this case, you have the bullock carts, the seed baskets carrying the seeds, the songs, these become, and the padayatra or the procession, these become the communicative infrastructures for articulating voice and for offering an alternative imaginary, but that very much is materially embedded in a form of practicing agriculture. So the work of creating communication infrastructures, especially in terms of how we do this work within the culture-centered approach, is one about building or co-creating advisory groups in communities that are at the margins of the margins. So these advisory groups are driven by the principle of who is at the margins of the margins, and how do these group spaces become open-ended spaces for inviting in the margins to have a voice. So in that sense, also the rules, the norms, the forms of communication that constitute the groups are continually being negotiated based upon the lived experiences of those at the margins, that are also continually organic in terms of opening up community spaces to the margins. Designing a framework for analyzing interplays of power. So whenever a group at the margin or a community at the margins has constituted a particular identity around being a community, because this is never a given. So the women in the example that you saw earlier have come together with the identity of Dalit women farmers, disenfranchised by existing forms of agriculture. So it is around this identity, which is also materially grounded in their practices, that they then start forming notions of group participation, notions of group solidarity, and notions of articulating for change. So in that process then, it is critical to analyze the interplays of power. Where is power situated? What are the spaces in which power is distributed? How is power tied to infrastructures of communication, particularly in terms of who speaks, who does not speak, who has access to resources, who does not have access to resources? Mapping of power helps you plan your framework for addressing the communicative inequality that constitutes the margins. Describe and explore the sites of erasure. What are the sites of erasure? How are these sites being reproduced? And once again, when you map these sites of erasure, you then can develop strategies for addressing the ways in which these erasures are being carried out. Describe and explore the structural challenges to voice, where those at the very margins work with activists, work with academics, work with community organizers and community researchers to identify the structural challenges to voice. So what are the ways in which the structure silences? So within the context of neoliberal economies, across the globe, you have tremendous attack on workers' unions. Particular forms of work, such as the work of cleaning, has been precarized so that workers don't really have the basis or the register to organize around the identity of cleaners. So exploring these structural challenges to voice then helps one develop a framework for strategizing how to address these structural challenges. Co-creating pedagogies of democracy. So what are the ways in which then those that are at the margins of the margins, subaltern communities, as Gayatri Spivak talks about, can come into hegemony? So within the context of COVID-19, the question becomes, how do we co-create pedagogies of democracy with the very margins so that they can come into hegemony, can can come into those spaces of decision making and policy formation, so that they can work toward imagining other futures, so that these spaces for imagining other futures are not occupied by interlocutors like us, although we do have vital roles in terms of crafting solidarities. But what would it mean for these spaces actually to be taken up by precarious workers, by migrant workers, by those living in slums where we have seen a rapid spread of COVID-19? And thinking through then specific forms of democratic participation. So what forms of participation would work within these structures? So would petitioning be a method? And again, the pedagogy of this being co-created with communities means that when we are developing the means of learning these techniques together, they are anchored in community voice and in the recognition of community agency, that those at the very margins very much have the capacity to participate in these spaces and make decisions that are meaningful to their lives. How do we co-create communication pedagogies of interventions from the margins? So how do we invert or dismantle the top-down interventions which we are surrounded by, that are often clueless, sending out messages such as wash your hands when you don't have access to water? How can that kind of messaging be displaced by messaging of advocacy that says, first, we need to advocate for access to water. We need to advocate for access to toilets and shower, or we need to have access to decent housing, and this needs to happen in the immediate context. So building communication pedagogies grounded in the margins becomes the basis for co-creating interventions that are directed at the top, that are directed at policymakers, that are directed at the global structures, with the idea of transforming them, with the idea of reorganizing them in logics of social justice and equality. And then anticipate and build strategies for response. Know that when you're building communicative infrastructures, there will be various forms of attacks on these infrastructures. There will be forms of attacks that discount the agentic capacity of those at the margins. There will be forms of attacks that fix those at the margins as incapable. Or there will be attacks that devalue evidence. So anticipate these attacks and prepare strategically, because the work of building communicative infrastructures at the margins is strategic. Once again, here I have some image for you and a little video snippet from CARE's ongoing fieldwork in the Santali regions of West Bengal. This work actually is almost 3 decades. And in this work, one of the things that we have witnessed is that when communities organize, when indigenous communities organize to create spaces that are meaningful to community life, to community rhythms, and that are anchored in community voice, those become powerful resources for challenging the dominant narratives. So, say for instance, for many Santali advisory groups within the context of West Bengal and Eastern India, health is about relationship with trees. So their journeys for health and well-being are integrally intertwined with their struggles for protecting the forests, for protecting their relationships with their forests, and for challenging the state-based diktats that often disenfranchise and erase them from these spaces. So let's go to Jhargram in West Bengal and look at one such example of community participation, which is in the form of community dance. but it is through dance that the community expresses its notion of communicative sovereignty that we discussed earlier. So you see here, once again, the very idea of communication and what it means to communicate about health and well-being through messaging that incorporates certain aspects of culture, such as incorporating the Santali script, is inverted. And the very basic question, what does health mean to you, emerges as a basis for articulating health as cultural practices that are dynamic and that are situated at the same time in relationship with the ancestors, in relationship with the trees, in relationship with performances that celebrate this spiritual connection with trees and healing. So connected to COVID-19 then, to build communicative infrastructures that are culturally centered and anchored in cultural voices is to challenge hegemonic top-down cultural sensitivity approaches that see responding to culture as just creating some linguistically appropriate messaging that emerges from the top, directed at the margins of the margins. And instead, fundamentally reworking these spaces such that they are owned by those at the margins, and really beginning with the question, how do those at the margins imagine addressing the challenge of COVID-19? So if we were to begin with that starting point, say within the context of migrant worker outbreaks in Singapore, you would be asking, how do low-wage migrant workers imagine solutions to the COVID-19 outbreak in dormitories? And centering that question in migrant worker voice would give us important solutions that often would be missing from the hegemonic spaces, simply because of the embedding of these spaces within the overarching neoliberal ideology. So I am going to now set you up with an activity and encourage you to do this as you're working through this lecture, or perhaps at the end of this lecture. And this asks you to examine how power shapes communication, particularly in terms of looking at communicative spaces and asking who speaks, who participates, who is erased from discursive spaces, who determines the zones of participation and engagement. And this is critical because across authoritarian regimes of the globe, including authoritarian systems of governance within larger liberal democracies, there is a growth of what I call the engagement industry. So the engagement industry is a site for co-opting participation, where the rules of participation are created by those in power. Those in power select who is going to participate, and this becomes a way for neutralizing the transformative capacity of participation. So we should ask the question, who determines the zones of participation and engagement? Who determines the objectives of participation and engagement? And then who determines the rules of participation and engagement? When you participate in this exercise, what will become apparent to you is the way in which power within our societies shapes these forms of communication and these structures of communication, including shaping those spaces that are participatory, or those spaces that are marketed as spaces of engagement. So I encourage you to do this. I will now move on to the next part of this lecture. So the culture-centered approach then argues that the work of building communicative infrastructures has to begin by investing in infrastructures of listening. So I want to share with you a couple of quotations to elucidate this point. The first is the voice of Rosie Thomas, who was a lead community organizer with the work that our team did in Lake County, Indiana, which is Gary, Indiana, south of Chicago, primarily African-American industrial town that has also seen recently the large scale spread of COVID-19. And this is what Rosie said. The powerful want to tell things the way they see them, in their own way, in ways that feed their interests. So she asked us, what is your role? Listen to us, work with us, collaborate on things that we can do on the ground that represent our interests. So pay attention to this. You know, the notion that the academic or the community interface being told that work with us, with the agenda being established by us, with goals that serve our interests. It has been so many times that our interests are not really heard. The community feels isolated and no place to go to. So we work together in making the avenues where our voices can be heard so that they matter. So the question for building infrastructures for listening are tied to the broader questions of how are community interests served, and anchored in the notion then that communities know best how their interests are served. Communities have agentic capacities to participate in decision making, and unfortunately, the kind of vanguardist logic that you see in deep neoliberal structures that fundamentally undermine community agency is also often replicated by progressives who would argue that communities don't really know, they don't really have the capacity, so how do we educate them? What Rosie is saying, and this is consistently articulated in our ongoing work, is that the starting point to addressing inequalities is to address communicative equality, is to recognize the agentic capacities of communities. And this happens by building infrastructures of listening in the spaces that we inhabit. Here's Nadamma from DDS, the example that you saw earlier. And she talks about the video-based documentary making that has become a way for the women farmers to articulate their voices and to intervene into knowledge structures. And she says, when we hold these cameras, we tell our stories. When we run the radio station in the community, we tell the stories grounded in our lives. So it's not the money that the big people pay to sell their version, which is where she's referring to the advertising spots that are bought on radio that promote biotechnology-based agriculture, which is always about making profit by making fools of us. So on the radio, these are stories of what farmers are really going through here in Warangal. And Warangal is one of the key sites of farmer suicides in the backdrop of the massive intervention of neoliberal agriculture, and here in Pasapo. So within the backdrop of this onslaught of neoliberal agriculture and the crisis produced by it, which is quite similar to COVID-19, of course, over an extended period of time, owning these communicative infrastructures for voice become ways of producing knowledge that disrupt neoliberal hegemony, that disrupt the dominant assumptions that constitute neoliberal hegemony, but also then build practical politics that is oppositional, that is a way of doing things, in this case, a way of producing food anchored in community life and community knowledge. So one of the things that we learn here then is that integral to this production of communicative inequality is the legitimation of erasure. So erasure is legitimized through particular forms of producing knowledge that celebrate specific forms of elite knowledge, often under meritocratic logics, and in order to do so, erase the voices of the margins. So the margin must be produced. The subaltern must be produced actively so that technocratic experts can have a voice, can have a say, can make decisions, and actually can have jobs. In many ways, the basic premise of the neoliberal economy is sustained on the erasure of voices of the margins. So recognize that knowledge production is political work. This act of producing expert-based knowledge is political. It is political because it simultaneously erases the knowledge generative capacities of the margins. The margins must be turned into bodies without agency, without culture, without the capacity of knowledge in order for the dominant top-down narratives to work on them. And yet, here is the irony, though. Once the margins have been erased of cultural linkages and cultural stories and cultural practices, a hegemonic narrative of culture is imposed on the margins, such that the margins can now be portrayed in stigmatizing language, only to then justify colonial top-down interventions that prop up the market and support it. So we have to ask the question, who produces knowledge? And fundamentally, we have to ask the question, what is the ideological basis for that knowledge production, as well as what is the legitimacy for that knowledge claim being made? Who produces cultural artifacts and artifacts about culture? So when you talk about migrant culture within hegemonic context, who is producing the narrative? So within the context of COVID-19, for instance, we have seen behavioral scientists come up with responses such as, we need to actually create messages that are responsive to the cultures of the margins. Well, within these contexts, the culture of the margins has been extracted and then superimposed on the margins in specific ways in order to keep the neoliberal status quo intact, in order to keep its individualizing reductionist narrative intact. So we need to also be asking, who measures and evaluates cultural artifacts? Who funds the production, circulation, and consumption of knowledge, and knowledge that is culturally embedded, and knowledge of cultures? In this process, then we also need to attend to the cultures of neoliberalism. So we need to attend to the cultures of meritocracy and thus deconstruct the very opaque sort of knowledge producing frameworks that are propped up in front of us as universals, as if we are supposed to accept them without questioning. And then we need to ask, what are the possibilities of knowledge production outside of the logics of capital? So COVID-19, in that sense, as a crisis that lays bare and makes visible these deep inequalities, also makes visible that notion that these deep inequalities are unsustainable. The ways of doing things under extreme neoliberalism that we have witnessed over the last 3 decades at an accelerated pace are unsustainable. So what are the spaces and sites of imagining alternatives? And what do these alternatives look like in terms of materializing different forms of politics and economies? So here in this example, I have for you the first white paper on migrant worker health that CARE had released in Singapore in 2015, and this was in collaboration with the civil society organization Health Serve. And this paper documented the experiences of low-wage Bangladeshi migrant workers in Singapore with food insecurity. Now, as an example, what was salient about this paper is that it's sought to build a register anchored in migrant voices. So advisory groups of migrant workers first identified what were the key challenges to their health and well-being, and they identified it as food. Then they supported as well as co-participated in creating the research design, including designing the in-depth interview protocols and the survey protocols. They collaborated with us in making sense of the emergent survey data, and then on developing strategies for advocacy. And one of the things they were very clear about in terms of making articulations in registers of knowledge in Singapore is that they wanted to produce a white paper that was public, but they also wanted to communicate directly with the Singapore public, which is why collaborating with CARE, their work was primarily focused on creating messaging, creating video messages, creating ads that could be placed on buses and on MRTs, drawing attention to the question of food insecurity, but also creating a register for dialogue with citizens in Singapore. So this is an example of knowledge production from the margins working against the everyday forms of erasure. And in doing so, then, these articulations as well as the solutions attached to them offer us new ways of organizing our societies. In our ongoing work with low-wage migrant workers within the context of COVID-19, they have offered a variety of solutions that then CARE has put out in the form of white papers with specific recommendations. Again, these recommendations are embedded in their everyday lived experiences, but as forms of knowledge, they intervene into and challenge the dominant forms of knowledge production that have historically erased them. So building these infrastructures of listening serve to disrupt the silences that are perpetuated by the dominant structures. They offer us entry points for imagining alternative social, political, economic systems and structures. They also offer us a framework for making impure dominant categories. So when you listen to the voices of low-wage migrant workers within the context of the COVID-19 outbreak in dormitories, one of the narratives that is emergent from those voices is a narrative of structural impediments to physical distancing. So they say that they are unable to follow the 1 meter distancing guideline simply because of the ways in which the dormitories are designed. They therefore offer a solution in terms of how dormitories need to be designed in the long term, as well as what needs to be done within the immediate context in terms of how the workers are housed. So this is an example of making impure dominant categories, particularly dominant claims or articulations that this outbreak has happened because migrant workers have not been following safe, healthy behaviors, for instance. That is disrupted by their voices that say that they are well aware of the solutions they need to practice. The challenges that they face are related to the design of the structures within which they exist. So thinking about this question of how do we listen to the margins, then this is activity 2 for you. And I think this is an activity as a reflexive exercise. I have my team work through in every field collaboration, field solidarity work that we do. How do we learn to learn from the margins? So how do we actually build pedagogies, co-create pedagogies that are anchored in the lessons that emerge from the margins? What resources are necessary to build these infrastructures for listening? So to map out, to look around yourself and then to see what kinds of resources can you draw upon? And of course, for those at the margins that participate in those conversations, they will bring resources. So if you think about the work of the women farmers, for them, the resources are the bullock carts on which they can take the traveling seeds that are embedded within their community lives. So from within local logics and knowledge systems emerge ways of building infrastructures. What are the communicative strategies for responding to silencing and violence? So when the margins speak, and this is often evident in many of the interventions that CARE has worked in solidarity with, that when the margins speak, the dominant structures will respond. They will seek to erase the voices. They will seek to delegitimize the voices. So how are you going to respond to these strategies of silencing and erasure? And what are the resources for building community anchored solidarities for voice? Where do solidarities lie? How are we going to cultivate these solidarities? How are we going to multiply these solidarities and draw upon them to amplify these voice structures? So I will go back to the earlier slide in terms of the key points about listening that I had raised and show you an example.
Eating this food, we have no energy left in our body. Due to this, we often fall ill and visit to the hospital.
Many workers work at construction sites every day in Singapore. Having decent food is essential to a healthy body. Food that is unclean or unhygienic can adversely affect health of workers. Having sufficient quality and quantity of food is a basic health need of every worker.
Respect the food rights of workers.
So this entire messaging was created by an advisory group of migrant workers that did the media strategy, that developed the storyboarding, and then guided our production team through the work, as well as conversing with them iteratively till the final campaign was created. And one of the things that you recognize here is that this infrastructure of listening was co-created by the low-wage Bangladeshi migrant workers in 2015. And if you think about the lessons and the imaginaries that emerge from that, they offer us powerful insights into the context of the outbreaks in migrant worker dormitories in Singapore within the context of COVID-19. So imaginaries thus are seeded in not only for addressing questions now, but also for offering transformative anchors for how we organize our futures. Another example that I want to walk you through is within the context of Aotearoa, with our work in fielding, within the context of Maori health, and asking the question, what does it mean for Maori voices to own infrastructures of theorizing health and to create interventions into decision-making spaces, into policy spaces that are anchored in imaginaries grounded in everyday community life. So our Whānau Voices Matter campaign emerged from an advisory group of participants at the margins of the margins in fielding. And within the context of their everyday struggles with health, land and relationship with land emerged as key. So when a particular development project was emerging within the spaces of community life, taking over community space without appropriate consultation, our Whānau Voices Matter emerged as a space for articulating resistive strategies, for articulating Maori relationship with land, for articulating a claim to knowledge that challenges the neoliberal claim to knowledge, and for developing specific forms of interventions into policy and program frameworks. So let's take a look at that. Organizing within this context became the basis for challenging the decision made by the city council. And thus, through that, protecting ancestral Maori land and putting forth then an alternative form of economic political imaginary. So, when you're doing this work of building communicative infrastructures at the margins of the margins, there are various challenges that one would face because of the inequalities and the distribution of power in society, and because of the investment of the neoliberal elite in protecting the meritocratic, expertise-driven status quo. Because to the extent that the elite across societies can demonstrate that elite-based decision making is most efficient, most effective, it can sustain the neoliberal order. It can sustain the political economy of elitism and extraction while simultaneously legitimizing the erasure of communities from spaces of participation and voice. So have to think about how you map out the ways in which there will be sustained and systematic attacks on these communicative infrastructures. And these attacks can take various forms. They can take the form of direct violence, as we see in various parts of the globe. Many indigenous activists are often murdered through the collaboration between state and private transnational corporations, often working through hired vigilante armies. There are threats of violence to these communicative infrastructures. And again, we witness this across the globe. There are strategies of co-option where difference, voice infrastructures are co-opted into hegemonic structures by offering seductions, by offering the kinds of neoliberal rewards, by often using the strategies of divide and rule, so that some activists within the community are paid off so that the movement can be co-opted. We see strategies such as astroturfing at work in order to silence spaces of articulation. Often, manipulation becomes a key strategy to delegitimize structures. Structures will go to the extent of fabricating lies, putting up lies, which in my work I talk about as communicative inversions, inverting materiality on its head in order to prop up and sustain the legitimacy of the structure. There will often be stigmatizing campaigns that the structure will run in order to delegitimize the voices at the margins. And at other times, because of the nexus between state and private corporations, legislations will be used in order to silence voices at the margins.
Eating this food, we have no energy left in our body. Due to this, we often fall ill and visit to the hospital.
So let's look at that example that we saw and we had seen through earlier, so I didn't play the whole thing. I invite you to think through what then would be sustainable communicative infrastructures for low-wage migrant workers within the context of Singapore, both within the immediate context of COVID-19, but also for the long term that would actually work toward generating political and economic systems that are just, that are grounded in the rights of the workers to fundamental conditions of livelihood, to minimum wage, to basic healthcare, to decent accommodation and decent food. So the work of sustaining communicative infrastructures is first and foremost about co-creating sites of communication sovereignty, where communities at the margins of the margins own these spaces without being directed by or mediated by elites or elite interlocutors. Often we see civil society models where civil society tends to take up the space of mediation, and that taking up of the space of mediation also works within the context of sustaining the logics of civil society within the political economy of neoliberalism, where civil society organizations often secure their legitimacy and legitimacy for funding by playing that interlocutor role. Communicative sovereignty, though, has to decolonize that civil society infrastructure and that role of civil society in terms of really thinking through what are the infrastructures that are available for the margins, by the margins, owned by the margins, with interlocutors, of course, having a role only as in solidarity to support, to stand together when structures attack, to work together to secure resources, but recognizing the sovereignty of these spaces as owned by those at the margins. Identify strategies for creative response. So creativity is at the heart of building structures of communication at the margins of the margins. So for the Dalit women farmers, the bullock carts where the creative communicative infrastructures through which they could get their messages out. Often in India, you see padayatras or street processions as communicative infrastructures for getting the message out. Often songs become infrastructures. In Singapore, you have migrant poetry as an infrastructure for creatively responding to the broader structures. Co-create support resources across spaces. Know that when these communicative structures are attacked, it's important to have multiple legs and multiple anchors and roots of support across spaces so that one form of attack in one particular space does not shut down the structure, which needs to my next point, which is building plural networks of solidarity across spaces. So connecting with other movements, with others at the margins of the margins elsewhere, and finding spaces that would actually stand up in solidarity to sustain the infrastructures. Attend to timing. Timing is vital to sustaining communicative infrastructure. When would your voices be heard to the outside? And when would you stay silent as a strategy for responding to the structure? And then thinking through again, when would you emerge? Sort of planning out the timing so that it enables the sustenance of the structure. Strategize presence. Where are you going to be present? In what accounts? How are you going to speak? How are you going to support the infrastructures and their voices as they speak within discursive spaces? And then how is that presence going to be sustained over time? How do you connect across spaces? Just like we talked about building plural networks of solidarity, it is vital to think through the connections across spaces that produce these precarities. So say, for instance, for the migrants that we saw in the context of India, on the highways of India, those sites of precarity are deeply intertwined with precarities that are produced in India's villages and India's suburban spaces with the ongoing land grab in these spaces. So connecting across these spaces, across issues and movements is vital to sustaining infrastructures. And then co-creating multiple nodes for voices so that there can be many different voices that speak together and speak collaboratively, speak in solidarity to bring about structural transformation. Ultimately, these change processes that are anchored in communicative infrastructures thrive on the notion of commitment, recognizing that this is long-term work. And this is an image from the campaign that the Bangladeshi migrant workers had created in Singapore called Respect Our Food Rights. And they felt that to get the message out, it was vital to be in public spaces. And one of the ways in which they did it is putting up these ads on the backs and the sides of buses. So commitment within this sense meant to commit to the kinds of strategies that the workers created, even though that might not actually work with the existing codes and norms of the dominant structures. So then the question is, how do you transform those structures? How do you push those structures? How do you mobilize through those structures in order to sustain those spaces? So the question of commitment also brings then to the foreground the idea of placing the body on the line, because to commit, as in the case of the bus advertising, when it was going to be in the public space, there were many different forces that sort of interrogated with this question that why is this scholarship? Why is this academic work? To commit is to commit to the idea of voice and to work through those various logics in seeking to transform those dominant existing logics. So to ask the question, how can my body disrupt power? What resources do I have available in disrupting power? How can I lend my body to others in solidarity? Who can I count on? Because even as you lend your body in solidarity, you need to count on your networks that enable this work of sustaining structures. And how can my body on the line create infrastructures for erased voices?
When I see the bars and MRT, the advertise our helps us the food, good food advertise. This one I see and my feel very happy, and I hope the Singapore people can see this one, and foreigner worker how to what eat this one. Always I see the no good food and catering one. This one foreigner worker eat after body problem. Always go the clinic and MC. Can this one be Singapore people see and can like this do and check the catering what the food eat and cooking, how to cooking.
So to commit to voice infrastructures then is to collaborate, to work alongside, so that these spaces for voices, for narrating these stories can be created and sustained over the long term. As you see in this narrative, what is powerful is the ability to tell a story that actually interrogates the dominant logics and the dominant narratives, but also then that draws attention to the lived experiences at the margins. So within the context of communication infrastructures for COVID-19, the relevant questions that emerge from the concept of communicative inequality and seeking to build communicative equality are these: how do we co-create spaces for the voices of the margins now and in the longer term? How do we challenge the expertise-based models of neoliberalism, as well as the top-down frameworks of vanguardism that seek to speak for the workers, and instead building infrastructures of listening that seek to make space for worker voices? How do we co-create spaces that are owned by the margins of the margins? And these spaces are going to be vital, especially as across nations, communities respond to lockdowns, as well as nations come out of lockdown and start planning for transitions. How do we explore creative strategies for foregrounding narratives that are anchored in lived experiences? So what spaces can we make for stories that are deeply tied to the lived experiences, and that therefore through these lived experiences challenge the neoliberal narratives that are circulating within the context of COVID-19? Here I love the work of Naomi Klein, who says that for neoliberals, every crisis is an opportunity. So for those of us that work on social justice, issues related to justice. The crisis, COVID-19, is also an opportunity for transformative imaginaries. And for the CCA, the argument is that these transformative imaginaries need to be anchored in the lived experiences and voices of those that are experiencing the deep marginalization now and that have been experiencing the deep marginalization over the last 3 decades. Draw on networks of existing advisory groups and or community organizations. So in the work that we do in the CCA, we co-create these advisory groups based on the principles of the margins of the margins. And these advisory groups emerge as creative spaces for addressing the crisis, for drawing attention to structural issues, for responding to them as communities, as well as for offering structurally directed solutions. So how do we build these advisory groups within the current context? How do we build these advisory groups within the context of post-COVID-19 transition, and how do we sustain them with an emphasis on voice infrastructures that interrogate the deep structural inequalities that are perpetuated by neoliberalism? How do we co-create new advisory groups in response to COVID-19 that are anchored in notions of voice democracy and democratic distribution of spaces for voice? How do we develop multiple layers of circulating stories that resist the attacks by structures? So as structures clamp down, developing a framework of layering, layering that supports and nurtures these communicative infrastructures, and at the same time offers sites of resistance to the attack by the dominant structures, is critical in terms of sustaining the voice infrastructures. As I said earlier, the narratives anchored in lived experiences at the margins challenge the dominant narratives. So how do we continue to challenge the dominant narratives that are being circulated and that will continue to be circulated within the context of COVID-19? How do we attend to the structural issues that are rendered visible now with COVID-19, and that with voices of the margins can become the sites where we can develop particular communicative efforts of advocacy and activism for structural transformation? How do these infrastructures enable the margins of the margins to narrate stories that foreground structures, that COVID-19 is fundamentally a structural problem and therefore needs to be dealt with structurally and needs to offer the basis for imagining solutions such as universal healthcare, imagining solutions such as universal food access, universal basic income, universal decent housing. These are key points. There are many movements that are emerging in the communities at the margins, and voice infrastructures become ways of sustaining these and narrating these stories into the dominant structures to interrupt into the narratives of neoliberalism, foregrounding solutions from the margins. As I move toward wrapping up, I want to say that the work of building communicative infrastructures and sustaining them is strategic. So to address the deep-seated communicative inequalities, we need to take both short-term and long-term approaches. The short-term approaches directly respond to the context of COVID-19, while the long-term approaches consider ways in which these communicative spaces can be sustained and built and connect with each other, connect with resources that are being generated at the margins of the margins, resources that are being generated by communities across the globe, resources that are being generated by advocates and activists, and finding ways of sustaining infrastructures in the local through connections at the global. So these ways of building communicative equality, creating communicative infrastructures at the margins, offer us entry points into creating radical democracies of the everyday, whereas with the work of the women farmers, the work of research, the work of knowledge production, the work of media production, the work of policy making, turned into the hands of those at the margins of the margins, offer us transformative openings. So with COVID-19, for instance, one of the areas that I can think of is consider homelessness. What would it mean for those that are rendered homeless in our societies to take charge of research processes, to take charge of knowledge generation processes, to take charge of media infrastructures where they can tell their stories, and to take charge of policy making infrastructures, both in response to COVID-19 as well as in response to long-term transformations that are much needed in our societies across the globe. I would love to wrap up with the idea that the futures that are local, because these struggles across the margins of the margins around the globe are very local, are also global. The futures that are embedded in our everyday struggles, the futures that are embedded in the struggles of the communities at the margins in specific sites of the flows of neoliberal capital are deeply intertwined with each other, because neoliberalism thrives through the connections between spaces that produces the mobility of labor, capital, material resources, and profits across the globe. So that logic can be inverted on its head in terms of thinking about generating these connections from the margins of the margins into the networks across global spaces to imagine alternative futures. I would love to wrap up with this excerpt from a conversation with Kali, who's a Santali community activist. At the time of my conversation with her, she was 32, and she said to me, there is something else outside this that is possible. So the idea of co-creating these communicative infrastructures at the margins is that through these infrastructures, the kinds of imaginaries are put forth that invite us to other ways of organizing our politics, our economics, our societies, and our cultures. So social change amid COVID-19 is change work that is now, that is in the immediate context, that is in the context of the ways in which we organize, we do our advocacy and activist work to sustain communicative infrastructures for the margins of the margins, in narrating their experiences with COVID-19, in highlighting the kinds of structures that have produced and sustained these deep inequalities, and in developing immediate solutions to these deep structural inequalities. But these are also invitations to imagining an entirely different future, a future that is grounded in ideas of equality, and ideas of equality that begin with seeking to build communicative equality, where communities as decision makers, as participants, as owners of sovereign spaces, try to develop the kinds of solutions that are meaningful to their lived experiences. Thank you for participating with me in this conversation. I hope you found it meaningful. I hope you found the questions meaningful. I look forward to chatting with you over Facebook as you post your questions. So please feel free to post your questions on the comment box and I will respond to them. But also as you go through the exercises, and if you want to chat more, you're always invited to write to me, and I will ask Richard to put up my email ID along with the talk when the talk goes up. Thank you once again for joining us, and this is hopefully an opening for a lot of us across the globe to work together to imagine what are the other kinds of possibilities that we can create.